pleasant midwinter's day. So what are we going to discuss today, or look at, examine? We can't discuss, can we? Because you can't talk back. But examine. Look, I'm interested in the concept beyond the pale. And now a lot of people think that the term beyond the pale comes from the English establishment of Dublin in Ireland and the establishment of a paling fence to keep out the undesirables. Well, it actually has a longer history. It comes from the Latin latus, which means pointed stick. So basically it means beyond. What's accepted has to be civilised. Anything beyond the paling fence, beyond the pointed stick fence, is somehow unacceptable. Something we shouldn't discuss, something we shouldn't look at. Now it's interesting that since the beginning of time, there have always been issues and individuals that have been considered to be beyond the pale. And as time progresses, many of the ideas which were considered to be beyond the pale are now part and parcel of everyday life. I'm specifically looking, obviously, at a Western so-called liberal parliamentary democracy. Things like access to healthcare, things like access to public education, things like the abolishment of slavery. 300 years ago, slavery was common. Been around for thousands of years. Today, it's a minuscule part of the problem worldwide. So what are the ideas? What are the discussions we don't have at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century in Australia? What are the ideas which are beyond the pale? Now, obviously, personality politics is no longer beyond the pale. People have accepted that people of different sexualities, genders, races, creeds, religions, nationalities, languages. To a significant degree, discussions regarding these issues is not considered to be beyond civilised discussion, civilised behaviour. But it's fascinating that has the grounds for personal liberty expand, the discussion regarding economics, wealth, how it's accumulated, how it's distributed, are somehow become discussions which are beyond the pale in 21st century Australia. And to a significant degree, these ideas were commonplace in the first part of the 20th century and even the second part of the 20th century. Ideas regarding wealth creation outside of investment. Ideas regarding redistribution of wealth. Ideas regarding the necessity of an adequate social security net were all relevant discussions. If you go back and look at the historical record, you will see that these were part and parcel of everyday discussion and everyday struggle in Australian life. What we've seen in the last 50 years is the destruction of one of the few organisations in society that was able to bring these matters up for discussion and actually match that discussion with industrial muscle or workplace muscle. That's the trade union movement. In 2025, the trade union movement in this country is almost non-existent. Different to the historical accounts at the beginning of the 20th century and during the late 19th century of how working people came together and worked collectively and used their muscle to improve their economic situation, and discussions about economic inequality were at the forefront of everyday life. So with the destruction of one of the few organisation which looks at and had the power to influence productivity and influence creation of wealth and influence how wealth is created and how it's distributed, with the destruction of that movement, we have seen a drift into personal politics and the environmental movement. And somehow we've forgotten at the centre of all discussion is the discussion about inequality of power and wealth. The greater the inequality in power, the less impact we as individuals and communities and groups have on the direction society takes. The more centralised and hierarchical governments and corporations become, the more difficult it is to wield any influence, especially when one of the few organisations which was able to pressure the investment class no longer exists. That's the reality. As pressure decreases on the decision-making processes in this country, the need for reform disappears. It all becomes about personality politics, to a lesser degree the environment. And the problem is, as we've seen with the environment and the climate emergency, is that we are replicating the very corporations and institutions which made energy security a hierarchical, centralised system. So there are issues which are beyond the pale, because these discussions and issues, which are not to be brought up in polite society, threaten both the power and wealth of a shrinking minority in this country. And that's the key. Do you have the power to threaten? And if you don't have the power to threaten, do you have the power to initiate change by working up the right channels? And when I use the word threaten, I'm not talking about physically threaten, but I'm talking about threaten the status quo. Threaten the direction the discussions that we should have are moving in. Because currently, even reform, even minuscule reform of the economic system is considered to be beyond the pale in Australia in 2025. When people talk about tax reform, they don't talk about tax reform, they're talking about increasing productivity and increasing profitability. When people talk about tax reform, they're not talking about ensuring that everybody pays their fair share of tax. They're talking about expanding the tax system in such a way as to increase revenue. So it's very easy to maintain the status quo when the institutions which govern us, including the institutions which create our laws, are subsidiaries to a higher authority? And I'm not talking about God. I'm talking about a higher authority. An authority which is the power to determine and regulate the lives of millions of people. An authority which has the power to influence the legislative agenda. An authority which has the power to initiate and change laws to suit its own ends. Now, most people think a democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people. That's totally incorrect. A democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. And the tragedy about 2025, the tragedy about artificial intelligence, the tragedy about the virtual world is that we are no longer engaged in the decision-making process. We are quite happy to leave it to the expert to make those decisions for us. We are quite happy to think our only responsibility as a citizen is to cast a ballot every 3 to 4 years. And that's the reality we face. And when you have a reality where power and wealth continues to be concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, more and more and more ideas are considered to be beyond the pale. Ideas were commonplace and no longer relevant. Now, some of the ideas which I've been talking about now for years, which are considered to be beyond the pale, are nothing more than a rehashing of ideas of the past. How do you improve the tax base, or how do you expand the tax base? Well, instead of looking at expanding the goods and services tax, which has the greatest effect on those least able to afford it, why don't we look at ideas that expand the tax base by placing a financial burden on financial transactions? Why not have a 1% financial transaction tax on every financial transaction over, say, $2,000 or $3,000 in this country? Most people wouldn't feel it, but the problem is, with a financial transaction tax, unlike a goods and services tax, the maximal effect will be on those who have the most assets, not the 33% of Australians who lead a hand-to-mouth existence on social security benefits. It'll be the 1%, the 8% investment class, which will have to dig in their pockets to support society. So that's why such an idea is beyond the pale. It's beyond a polite conversation. It's not to be discussed, let alone raised. How about a 1% stock market transaction tax on every time a stock or share is bought or sold? Although most working Australians, not all Australians, have the benefit of superannuation, and half of that superannuation is invested in the stock market, the fact is that most Australians do not directly own shares. So 1% stock market shares tax would again affect those with the most. That's why such a discussion is considered to be unrealistic, beyond the pale. Considering the ASX in Australia is fully computerised, such a tax would be easy to impose and the cost would be minuscule. Let's move on. Everybody talks about artificial intelligence. They talk about the virtual world. They talk about the digital revolution. But discussions about how the digital revolution is conducted, who are the handful of people who own the assets via which the digital revolution expands, why have they become stronger than sovereign nation states? Why are they able to determine the future of a nation, say like the United States of America, to suit their ends and their ends only, are again beyond the pale, not for discussion. The fact is that we should welcome artificial intelligence, because for the first time in human history we will be able to escape the drudgery of everyday existence, of everyday life. But the fact is that in a society which revolves around wage slavery, wage labour, increasing numbers of unemployed people pose a direct challenge to the institutional structures which currently determine the fate of each and every one of us. So the discussion that we should be having on a daily basis as artificial intelligence removes more and more people from the workforce is the concept of a universal basic income. Now, why is such an idea beyond the pale? Can't be instituted, can't be discussed. This government is holding a productivity conference, and I assume in the near future it'll hold a tax reform conference, to which it will invite people who have ideas which are acceptable to those who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. These are the people whose ideas we will hear. People like you and me, who are more interested in devolving power and holding wealth and using it for the common good, will once again be considered to be beyond the pale, a social nuisance, somebody who needs to be tolerated but not listened to. But the good thing is, history moves on. History moves on irrespective of what you and they think. And human beings adapt to different situations. And irrespective how onerous and authoritarian unequal societies are, human beings adapt. And like in situations of extreme emergencies like floods and fires and cyclones and hurricanes, where people are forced to work collectively to attempt to resolve the issues they find themselves in, we are moving from a period where the individual and the community will once again be able to play a significant role in society, a significant role in terms of how wealth is distributed, how wealth is created. Because the people, as the Romans found out, who have nothing to do, who are excluded from the wage system, they will revolt. And that's the situation. Artificial intelligence is a boom, a blessing and a curse. And what way we use it, who controls it, how it's used, how parliaments and institutions react is fundamental to the struggle to create a more egalitarian community in this country.